You are a fake, a phony, and undeserving of any accolades you might have ever received. If any words cut deeper than those, I don't know that I've heard them. It's this idea that we struggle with, and by we, I mean many people in society, that we are just, in fact, not good enough. These fears are pervasive and they seem to be growing, which is ironic that we live in a world today where everybody thinks they're an expert, except for the people who actually are. Experts begin to be more doubtful of their opinions and their ideas. It seems as though more people in high functioning, high stress positions think that they are not, in fact, who they think they are. This has given rise to a common term known as Imposter Syndrome. It's not a new term, it's been around since 1978, but this particular term, Imposter Syndrome, formerly Imposter Phenomenon, is a very common buzzword. Today on the Didactic Cafe, I want to talk to you a little bit about whether or not you have imposter syndrome or just really, really intense self-doubt, because there is a difference. But I also want to look at some methods in which we perhaps are perpetuating imposter syndrome with our coworkers, our family, and our friends. My name is Chad Lehrman, and I'm your host for the Didactic Cafe. I first heard of imposter syndrome not that long ago. When I first started writing books and I began to spend some time on social media and discussing with my fellow authors these things, I began to see more and more authors talking about the concept of imposter syndrome, that I don't feel like I'm a real writer or I'm a real author unless I've done X, Y, Z. And typically what that meant was gotten with a traditional publisher or gotten a literary agent or completed a book or been published by a magazine or an article or something that was quote unquote legitimate. And this was often coming from the environments that I was in, which was the concept of independent publishing. Like as independent publishers, we tended to struggle with this. And the more I looked into it, the more I saw that many authors feel like they are not, in fact, true authors unless they've done X, Y, or Z. And so a few days ago, I posted a TikTok, which, by the way, I am Chad _ writer on TikTok if you want to follow there. And I asked that question, like, do you struggle with this? Is it imposter syndrome or is it simply crippling self-doubt? Which, to be fair, crippling self-doubt and imposter syndrome are in fact very, very similar. Now, before I go any further into kind of what I found in that interaction with folks on TikTok, but I want to do some definitions here. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to actually read a little bit of an article from the APA.org, which APA.org, APA is American Psychiatric Association. This is the preeminent force for psychological investigations, ethics, diagnoses. This is the big thing. It's important. And now the APA is very clear to say that there is no actual psychological diagnosis of imposter syndrome, although it is based upon some very powerful work done back in the 1970s. Okay, so first of all, let's see what it really says. It's this idea that it is a very real and specific form of intellectual self-doubt. Imposter feelings are generally accompanied by anxiety and often depression. This idea that I am not measuring up, and people are going to find me out, that I'm going to be found out as a poser, as an imposter, as a phony. Okay, so that anxiety then can lead to a sort of depression that settles in because you begin to feed into your own mind, you're not good enough, nor will you ever be good enough. And so that particular idea, it very easily could be seen to involve development and deepening in this. In this particular article, which by the way was posted on their website in 2013, so here we are almost 9 years ago, in this particular article written by Kirsten Weir, calling Feel Like a Fraud, basically makes the argument here that you feel this pressure to succeed. and to keep up with what expectations, societal expectations, career expectations, family, friend expectations are. And so you press and you press and you press, and you always feel like you're falling short. Now, it's one thing if other people are telling you you're a fraud. Like that is crippling in itself. But if your own brain, supposedly this part of you that is actually pushing you to do better and be this thing that you want to be, is also telling you that you can't be that thing, that's got to lead to some confusion and some anxiety and some definite concerns within your mind. So with this particular article, she mentions the specific first case of imposter syndrome, then called Imposter Phenomenon, in 1978. Psychologist Suzanne Imes, PhD, and Pauline Rose Clance, PhD, they created this idea. And they identified that it typically occurred in high achievers who are unable to internalize and accept their success. Okay, so if we take that definition, what that really means is that even if the rest of the world is lauding us with praise and believing our expertise, we ourselves are keeping in our brain this idea, this doubt that I'm really not good. So at the core of it, at the core of imposter syndrome, is this belief that we are not good enough. This article goes on to say that what Imes and Clance found was that they attributed their accomplishments to luck. These are the people struggling with imposter phenomenon, with luck rather than actual ability, and fear that others, and this is key, will eventually unmask them as a fraud. Okay, so I want to step back to my own personal journey. I've been a teacher for about 10 years now. Prior to that time, I had been a minister for 11 years. And in my time as a teacher, very, very early in my time, I began to feel self-doubt. I began to question whether or not I was in fact doing a good job. Now, I had plenty of positive feedback from students, from parents, from administrators, but there were little nagging things that were in the back of my mind telling me, are you really doing this? One of them was that I didn't know teacher lingo. And what I mean by that is that I would walk into a room with teachers and there would be all these little acronyms, things that they were throwing out that I didn't know what they were. I was not a college educated educator. I did not have a teaching degree. I had a bachelor's of speech communication. I got my alternative certification. So I didn't sit through what we call here in Texas anyway, the idea of like student teaching as we do it, where you have like a semester of modules where you kind of watch and observe and you're in the classroom and then you go and you do your own classroom. I didn't have any of that stuff. I didn't have all these different sort of activities. So there were things that they talked about that I just would nod my head and say, yeah, okay, yeah, I know what you're talking about. And I had no idea. So in that regard, these were not fundamental things, by the way. We're not talking like, I knew what an IEP was. I knew what an ARD meeting was. I knew what those things were. I knew those important factors. I knew what, the key things. I knew what a lesson plan was. But then they would throw in other words. And I would get confused and I would shake my head and I would move on. And I began to question, am I really a good teacher or am I just getting lucky? And so while it never got to a crippling factor to me, I think I had some self-confidence by starting teaching at a much late point in life, in my 30s. I think I had some confidence, but I could see where individual young teachers, new teachers who just walked out of the college classroom and stepped into a high school, middle school, elementary school classroom would struggle with that. And so with that being in mind, I know that it's a real thing, that there is a real aspect of it. I feel a little bit of this self-doubt right now. I'm teaching AP World History for the first time. And while I'm getting good feedback from students and I'm getting good feedback from parents and test scores are doing well and I'm grading these papers and I feel like the kids are doing really well, it's my first year. So there's a lot of questions that I'm having, like, am I doing enough? Like, am I there? And I want to stop here and say that if you are experiencing self-doubt, that's not necessarily bad. Self-doubt is actually, I think anyway, a beneficial part of the human process. If we never question what we do, we might be a narcissist. We might be living in this sort of mentality that we can't do anything wrong, so stop questioning me. Self-doubt keeps us honest. It keeps us correct. It keeps us recognizing that we can, in fact, make mistakes from time to time, and we do. So I know that my self-doubt right now is just self-doubt. It is not imposter syndrome. It is not me going, oh my gosh, they're going to find me out. It's not a freak out moment like that, okay? For me, my self-doubt is very much, let me evaluate my practices. Let me reflect and adjust. Now, I want to step back to another situation. This article that I was talking about talked about this idea of the pressure to achieve. And I think that this is where it comes into play for a lot of independent authors, artists in general, musicians, actual, paint on canvas type artists, those kind of things. I think this is where this really comes in. It says in the article, again, the APA article from 2013, many people who feel like imposters grew up in families that placed big emphasis on achievement, said Imes. In particular, parents who send mixed messages, alternating between overpraise and criticism, can increase the risk for future fraudulent feelings. Societal pressures only add to the problem. So what I say is that what I say about this is that I've been teaching in public schools for 10 years now. Prior to being an AP teacher this year, I taught debate students. A lot of them were AP students. And I hear AP students oftentimes in the 10 years that I've been doing this, it's not just this year, it's not just since COVID has hit and all that, it's always been present, that imposter syndrome was a real thing with high achieving students. And what it was I have to be perfect. And sometimes that was because mom and dad put that on them. And sometimes it was because they put it on themselves. They looked around at their peers and they were always comparing themselves to other people. And that means they struggled. If they got a 98 and their friend got a 99, they knew that meant that was a little teeny tiny point, but it was a little teeny tiny point that could make all the difference between them being one rank or a rank lower in their class. So that societal pressure, that pressure to achieve is definitely going to be a big factor. As authors, I this week was looking at some people who were posting, this is what I did in 2021. This was my end of year thing. And it's impressive. Some of them were posting, $200,000-$300,000. A couple even posted $1 million in sales this year as independent authors, and that's impressive and that's awesome. And then I looked at my $125 that I made, and my heart broke a lot. Now, to be fair, some of these authors have got dozens of books out. They've been doing this many, many years longer than I have. But it's scary and it's frustrating. And it makes me question, am I doing something right? I'm going to be a little bit arrogant here, and I'm going to say that I've read some of the content that some of these very big selling people have done. And again, it's subjective. All of this is subjective. My opinion doesn't matter. Like, it's my opinion, and you can write it off as being, hey, you're being petty because they're selling a lot and you're not. But I've read some of their stuff, and it's not that good. But they're selling well. Now, to be fair, I've also looked back at some of my earlier writings and gone, ooh, that's cringy. I wouldn't do that. I want to fix that. And so, I recognize that there's this process. I'm reading a book series right now, which for the sake of this will remain nameless. It's a very popular within certain, it's a subgenre of paranormal crime. So that probably tells you more than enough to know what it is. And I'm in the second book of the series. And honestly, I think I'm done. After I finish this book, I think that's it, because it's just not something that I don't find it very good or connecting. But the guy's successful. The writer is doing really, really well. And there's a lot of other books that are. So you can see where, as a writer, I would see that and I would begin to question, maybe I'm really not that good. Maybe my stuff isn't as good as I think it is. Maybe the people who have liked it and written good reviews, maybe they're just being nice. Maybe they're just being kind. And so that's where imposter syndrome kicks in. And that's where this idea starts to feed if you don't take control. Now, this is when imposter syndrome is something that is coming completely internalized. But I also said at the outset that I wanted to talk a little bit about how we maybe are creating that sort of environment. So in a second article, this one is from the Harvard Business Review, and it's a lot more recent. It's from February 11th of 2011, so about a year ago. This was written. It's called "Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome." So in this particular article, the authors postulate, they tell the story of a woman named Talisa Lavari. I may be completely missing that's pronunciation, but I apologize. But in this particular article, this woman is a high-profile attorney. She's a corporate management event. She's big time. She's well up in her business. And so in this particular business that she's in, she begins to feel imposter syndrome. This woman is African American and a female, and she begins to feel that she's not really qualified because she was the only African American woman on the job. And even though she was getting praise from the client, she begins to feel like she's just faking it, and that she's just lucky, and that she only got there because of whatever, that she didn't really earn it. It says that she became plagued by self-hatred, deep anxiety, and the feeling that she was a fraud. Classic imposter syndrome. Did it come from herself, or did it come from the fact that as she stepped back from her group and where she was working and began to recognize the system was in place, that perhaps we as a society have questioned people of color or females or the youth or people who don't have X number of years of experience, that they couldn't possibly be good at what they're doing because that's not the way it's always been. And then I realized that perhaps if I go further back in my own journey, by no means am I trying to equate myself with Miss Lavari, that what she struggled with and what she's been in. But as a minister, when I was a minister, I remember being told on a number of occasions things like, "You'll be a good pastor someday." I remember being told, "Well, once you get your seminary degree, then you will be XYZ." And I remember being told that, "Oh, well, you're young now and you're idealistic, so you can't possibly expect for things to happen that way." And while I would never have felt imposter syndrome because I was young and arrogant and I wasn't listening anyway, but the point is that as I think back to those things, had they taken root, that absolutely might have handicapped me. And it might have made me feel like I was never going to be a good enough minister or person. As we look at this particular study of imposter syndrome, and I go back to the same article from Harvard Business Review, and it says that this is a fairly common thing. And the article is talking about women, and it mentions women like Charlize Theron and Viola Davis and Sheryl Sandberg, and even Michelle Obama and Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. So you're talking about very high-performing, very high-profile women, and they don't feel like they're worth it, that they've done the right things. That's imposter syndrome. The article talks about this idea that makes sure, you should push back on this self-doubt, that you should fight back against it. It even says this, that this particular thing that becomes problematic is that some people find it difficult to find role models that are like them. And in the article from Harvard Business Review, it mentions that, as white men move higher up, they tend to feel more comfortable because they find people more like them. But as minorities and women move up, they find fewer people like them. And I think there's some truth to that. But because that gets into a muddier issue and a bigger issue than what we're talking about here today, I do want to say that I think imposter syndrome, just because you are a white male, hi, that's me, doesn't mean you can't also face this and struggle with this. In fact, there are a number of studies and a number of cases that have shown that oftentimes, like a white male who tries to identify, who does their best to try to understand a female who is struggling with this or is struggling with some sort of situation or tries to make connections with minority communities, they themselves will feel like imposters because they struggle to connect. They struggle to make that connection with other people. And in a time when we more than ever need to be communicating with people of diverse backgrounds and cultures and different genders and different belief systems, we don't need to have people afraid to communicate because they're not good enough. So what do we do? How do we fix this? The answer is we don't fix it. It's going to be there. It's going to be present. But what we can do is, for me, I can try to be active in encouraging people around me who might be struggling with self-doubt, who might even have imposter syndrome, to tell them that they are good enough and be genuine about it, to reinforce that they are capable, good, and need to be celebrated for what they do. But the internal monologue that I have, the only person who can affect that is me. The internal monologue that you have, the only person who can really change that, can change that conversation, is you. So how do you combat imposter syndrome? I think one of the problems that we run into, and as a writer, I'm speaking kind of to this group of us, and even as a teacher, is that we don't do a really good job of defining at the outset of our careers what success looks like. We maybe look at what other people are doing, and maybe that's the problem. By looking at what other authors do, by saying, well, this guy wrote his first book at 25, and look at he's a New York Times bestseller at 26, and it's great. And you know what? That's a great story for them, but it's not my story, and it's not necessarily your story. For every first-time author massive success story, there are failures, and there are people who wrote for a long time, or sang for a long time, or worked in the dungeons of high business for a long time before they broke through. So keep in mind, when you are starting to struggle with self-doubt, that everything is a process. I'm reminding myself of that right now. As a writer, I'm reminding that, I've had a good run this past week or two on TikTok. I've gained a lot of viewers. I've gained a lot of followers on there, and that's a great starting point. It has not translated into any sales at this point. But one of my goals was, if I can get to 1,000 followers, and I'm very close. Yeah, as I'm doing this, I'm like 4 away from 1,000. If I can get to 1,000 followers, that opens up a new tier of things that I can do on the platform that I'm hoping will help me to publicize and sell books more. Okay, so that's option one. That's a goal number one. So I'm looking at the growth that I've had this week and going, okay, I still don't have as much as some people do, but I'm gaining traction. Okay. As a writer, I'm looking at, I've been more consistent in writing this past week. I've been more consistent in getting, 1,000, 2,000 words a day down, which is for me good with a full-time job as well. So those are big pluses. I am a writer. And that's the other thing too, is that I have published books. I'm up to 8 now. I've published 8 books. And yes, they're independent published, but they are published. They are books that are out there. People have consumed them and people have reviewed them. I'm a writer. So if you've done that, you're a writer. If you haven't even put it out there, if you've written something down and you've kept it there and you've poured your heart and your soul into it, you're a writer. You're just not a published writer. All you got to do is find a way to put it out there. Okay, so my encouragement to you is to set manageable goals, because I think imposter syndrome creeps in when we don't have a clearly defined definition of what we view success to be. And that may change. Completely honest, that may change. Because when I started writing books, my view of success was very, very different. And I realized pretty quickly, I can't get there right now. So I adapted. What does that mean? For me, it's finding a good genre to write in, a good category on Amazon to put my book in, to where I can find some moderate levels of success. So I found a thing where all my books are in American horror. And American horror, there's some really cool books in there. Like, you're top of the list people in there. You got some Stephen Kings and Dean Koontzes and folks that have been writing these horror stories for decades. And they're really, really good. And I'm in that category, and I'm staying when I don't have a lot of sales. Even then, I'm hanging out around 200, the top 200 in that. But when I have a new book come out and it pops closer to the top and I end up hitting, because of the way the algorithms work, I hit in the top 100, that's a success for me, because it's visibility and because it is a measurable amount of success on the book. It doesn't translate into thousands of sales like I wish it would, but it translates into some sales and it's progress. So for me, it's about finding those manageable goals. As a teacher, going back to that particular time in my life when I felt like a phony because I didn't know certain acronyms and words, you know how I got over that? I either stopped caring about that acronym or I found out what they were. There's 2 ways to go about it. There are 2 ways to manage that particular thing. If you feel you're falling short on something and there's a way for you to fix it, work towards that. If you feel like you're falling short and you feel like you're falling short because you're just not lucky enough, that's not something you can control. So why worry about that? Why worry about, oh, I'm unlucky? Don't go buy a rabbit's foot. Don't go looking for 4-leaf clovers. Find what you can control and do the best you can at that. Which, if you really back it up and you realize that imposter syndrome is just another flavor of anxiety and depression, and that's really what it is, you treat it the same way. You learn to set boundaries and you learn to address the problems you can address and to let go of the things you can't. I want us to think today as we close. If you've ever reached this point where you question if you're real or you really are what you think you are, look yourself in the mirror and say what Stuart Smalley used to say on Saturday Night Live. I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. And if you don't remember what that is, it probably means you're well under the age of 40. But if you know what that is, and you know that Stuart Smalley, who later went on to become a senator as well, Al Franken, we're not going to talk about how that ended, but still, that phrase is still good. Power of positive thinking. Reinforce yourself. I can sit in front of a mirror and say, I know I'm a good writer. I know I'm a good writer. I know I'm a good writer. And it's not going to give me more sales, but it is going to help me with that internal monologue, that internal conversation to overcome those negativity moments. Guys, this has been the Didactic Cafe, and I'm your host, Chad Lerman.